we've seen that it's likely that we need more argument or evidence to show that the affect heuristic provides us with a genuine explanation of humans' moral intuitions. Now, I was thinking, where would we find that sort of argument or evidence? And the problem I face is that I'm honestly not really sure even what I'm looking for. So it seems to me sensible to offer a case study. What I want to do is to try to find a case where, perhaps outside moral psychology, where a heuristic has successfully been used to explain some unreflective judgments. And indeed, something called the affect heuristic has been used to explain judgments about risk. So what I want to do is to examine how that success took place, how successfully evidence and argument was used to establish the heuristic in the case of risk, and then work backwards from there to see what we would have to do in the case of moral intuitions. So that's my plan. I hope it makes sense. Here's the thought then. We're interested in judgments about whether an action is good or bad, right? But instead of that, we can instead think about judgments concerning whether a cancer is frequent, risky, or worth spending lots to avoid. Now, if you're like me, you might be struck by the thought that the question of frequency and the question of risk are actually one and the same, right? There aren't really two distinct questions there. Or if there are two distinct questions there, it's really like the distinction between sampling and probability, right? So in practice, the practical difference is not worth thinking about for most situations, unless we're doing stats, of course. So you might be struck by the thought, well, how can frequency and risk be regarded as different? The answer to that question is that when you frame it in terms of frequency versus when you frame it in terms of risk, people tend to give you quite different kinds of answer. People don't give the same answer. So although you might absolutely be right that frequency and risk are two different things, psychologically, are the same. You might be right that frequency and risk are not really distinct in the way that they're being presented as distinct here. Psychologically, we should distinguish them because people in their ordinary judgments do clearly distinguish those and offer conflicting answers to questions about frequency and risk, or apparently conflicting answers. All right, so that's the idea. So we have here some attributes: frequency, risk, and the value of a statistical life. How much is worth spending on to avoid a particular kind of cancer? And if you look at the article that I'm basing this on, Pakur and colleagues from 2012, you'll see that they offer table 1. You can't see it on the slides here probably, but it's also in the notes and their paper, where they specify for each of the 24 types of cancer what the actual frequency of that cancer is in a population. This is, I think, based on Switzerland, although I don't suppose the Swiss are that much different from other places, and then people's median judgments of how frequent it is, and goes on and gives you the other median judgments as well. So you can see what's going on here. Now, what's important for us is this: the attributes that we're asking people to track in making judgments are inaccessible. Right, they're unknown. So the subjects of this experiment, probably like you and I, right, unless you're a bit of a kind of nerd here for this sort of data, or you have some unfortunate personal experience with it, you're very unlikely to know much about the frequencies of different types of cancer, nor to have a clear basis for making comparative judgments about the value of a statistical life. I hope you're in that position. That's a happy position to be in, and a normal position to be in. So that tells us that all three attributes here are inaccessible. The attributes that we're being asked to track are inaccessible. We must therefore compute, so to say that the attribute's inaccessible is just to say that you're not in a position to make knowingly correct judgments concerning substantive matters and that attribute. You don't know how frequent the kind of cancer is, nor do you know much about their relative frequencies. And you can see that is the case actually, because if you go back and look at that table from the study, again, I'm sorry, you can't see this in the slides, but the judgments that people make are wildly different from the facts, right? People's judgments about frequency are quite different from the actual frequency. All right, good. So we've got some inaccessible attributes that people are being asked to track. So we know that they're not tracking these attributes by computing those attributes. They must be computing something else. We can therefore ask this question. You've seen this question before in a different guise. What might people compute that would enable their judgments to track frequency, risk, or the value of a statistical life? And Pahur and colleagues offer two accessible attributes as candidates. So people might be computing how easy it is to bring to mind a particular case, or they might be computing how imagining this makes them feel. So these are two attributes, and both of these attributes are accessible in the sense I just defined. People are in a position to knowingly make judgments about facts concerning these attributes, substantive facts. So potentially people could compute frequency, risk, and the value of a statistical life by using either or both of these attributes. Very simple idea. So Pahur and colleagues package this into two heuristics. They distinguish between an availability heuristic, according to which the easier it is to bring a case of this cancer to mind, the more frequent or risky it is, and the higher the value of the statistical life should be. So you could in principle use the availability heuristic, they say. But just here we have to ask the question, is that really a heuristic? Is that really a heuristic? I'm glad you asked. Good question. So what is a heuristic? Well, a heuristic is something very simple. In my view, a heuristic is just a connection between an inaccessible attribute, one that's to be tracked, and an accessible attribute, one that's to be computed, where the link between the two is such that by computing the accessible attribute, you are able to track, at least within limits, useful range of cases, even if limited, the inaccessible attribute. What that means then, first of all, is that for this to be a heuristic, it has to link an accessible and an inaccessible attribute. I think that's clear. I think it does that. And secondly, there has to be a useful range of cases, even if only a limited range of cases, in which the accessible attribute is correlated with the inaccessible attribute. And that correlation has to be exploitable by our subjects. So what we have to say in order to say that this is an heuristic is to say this, that at least within limits there'll be a useful range of cases in which how easy it is to bring a case of cancer to mind will correlate with how frequent that cancer is. For example, if we're thinking about frequency as our inaccessible attribute. So we will say, if that holds, if that correlation holds, then this is going to be a genuine heuristic. And it may be that it doesn't have to be a very strong correlation. It might be just strong enough to be useful, as I say, in a range of ordinary cases. So that's what we're committed to in saying that the availability heuristic is a heuristic. Now, Pahur and colleagues, as you will guess, also offer a second heuristic. They say this is the second heuristic, the Affect Heuristic, old name for a new heuristic. The more dread you feel when imagining it, the more frequent or risky it is, and the higher the value of a statistical life associated with it should be. And now I want to ask you, is this really a heuristic? What I want to do here is give you 90 seconds with your lecture buddy or buddies. If you're able to watch this with someone, I hope you are, then this is a good chance to talk to them. If you're not able to watch it with somebody, you can still have a think, or you can do what many people do, I suspect, and just skip forwards, as you like. The question is, for discussion, is the Affect Heuristic really a heuristic? Does it really qualify as a heuristic? 90 seconds, go. All right, so I wonder what you've been thinking here. Perhaps there are some questions that are going to come up in the live session later this week. In any case, I don't think the answer to this question is at all trivial, but I am going to take it for granted in what follows that we are all prepared to give a positive answer. We're prepared to allow that the affect heuristic is genuinely a heuristic, although I don't think that's a trivial matter at all. All right, so here's the hypothesis that Pecheur and colleagues offer. They suggest this: it's the availability heuristic that dominates frequency judgments, whereas the affect heuristic dominates risk and the value of a statistical life judgments. That's a really interesting hypothesis. So there's really two hypotheses in one. Their idea is that there's a contrast. It didn't have to be this way. You could imagine it was the other way around. But their hypothesis is that one heuristic is used in one case predominantly, and the other in the other cases. So that's their hypothesis, this contrastive hypothesis. And from this hypothesis, we can generate some interesting testable predictions. So from the idea that the availability heuristic dominates frequency judgments, we would predict this, that the number of cases in a subject's social network will better predict frequency judgments. And that makes sense, I suppose. So you would think that if people are relying on how easily something comes to mind, the availability heuristic, then the more people they know via their social network who've suffered a particular kind of cancer, the more likely it is, the more easily that type of cancer will come to mind. Right? So the availability heuristic would then cause them to judge it as more frequent. By contrast, if we think about the affect heuristic, then what we might imagine is this, that their feelings of dread will better predict risk and value of a statistical life judgments. So you can see how there's this beautiful contrastive prediction that allows us to test the hypothesis. What we're doing is, first of all, getting people to zip through these cancers and to tell us how frequent they think it is, how much at risk they think people are of dying from it, and how much money should be spent on saving a life of someone who is subject to that cancer. Each of those three things. And in addition, the researchers are measuring how many people in their social network have each kind of cancer, and they're measuring what people report in terms of how much dread they feel when faced with the thought of dying from that cancer. And that allows them to test the prediction. And the findings, to cut a very long story very short, is that both predictions are broadly confirmed. Both predictions are broadly confirmed. So this, I think, is a very interesting case, because it's a case, I think, a paradigm case where a hypothesis about heuristics has been successfully established via careful study. Now, of course, you shouldn't take my word for it. You should never trust a philosopher, particularly not your lecturer. You ought to evaluate the evidence for yourself and see if you agree. But I think this is a paradigm case. I'm not messing with you here. I'm not trying to do anything clever. I genuinely think this is a paradigm case that we can use to learn from. So where are we then? The affect heuristic concerning risk says the more dread you feel when imagining it, the more frequent or risky it is. This is an affect heuristic like the one that we were considering earlier in the case of moral intuitions, because it's about feelings. In general, I've suggested heuristics involve substituting inaccessible for accessible attributes, and where we have hypotheses about them, they need to generate testable predictions. If I want to find evidence for the operation of a heuristic, I need to test a prediction about the correlates or causes of the judgments that people make. Very simple. That's what we've done so far, and so far things are looking good. So then you say, Steve, how is this relevant to me? I'm really interested in moral psychology. I'm not interested in risk or human psychology generally. I'm really just interested in moral psychology. How is this relevant? Two thoughts. The first one is the fact that humans do use an affect heuristic in some cases in evaluating risk or the value of a statistical life supports the idea that they might use one in making unreflective ethical judgments as well. So, it gives kind of indirect support here. Now, I'm not saying, of course, that we should accept that the affect heuristic explains moral intuitions on the basis of this. I'm just saying, as you see here, that it's at least worth considering. That's my suggestion. And that's important. The second thought is that we can use this study as a model for what would account as evidence that humans use the affect heuristic in making unreflective ethical judgments in their moral intuitions. So we can use the Pahura et al. Study to see what kind of argument and evidence we would need in order to establish what Synod Armstrong and colleagues 2010 call the affect heuristic in moral psychology. So once again, the question that we've been looking at is, what is it that adults compute which enables their unreflective judgments to track things like frequency, the value of a statistical life, and risk? The question we really want to get to, though, is this question about what adults compute that enables their moral intuitions to track moral attributes such as wrongness. And in both cases, there is a hypothesis about affect. The idea is that how something makes you feel, dying of a particular kind of cancer or somebody performing a particular act, is used then to make an estimate of the risk or to make an estimate of the badness of that action. Importantly, in Pahura and colleagues, it's a background fact that the attributes we're asking about are inaccessible and therefore cannot be what the subjects are computing. This is not something which is established through the evidence, rather it's something which is known in advance. What the evidence is doing for us then really, in effect, is just deciding between one and another heuristic that people might be using. What the evidence is not doing is telling us that people are using a heuristic in the first place. So when it comes to the case in moral psychology, it seems to me that our position is a little bit different. So far, we tried to use evidence to get directly to the view that people are using an heuristic and that that heuristic is the affect heuristic. But that direct step, I think, leaves us with only very weak argument, an argument which I've suggested is much too weak. What we need is to try to follow the same pattern here, to regard the inaccessibility of moral attributes as something that has to be established in advance of considering the evidence. That's not what the kind of evidence that we're thinking about can establish for us. What we need then is an argument that moral attributes, like frequency, risk and the rest, are not things that people are readily able to know substantive facts about. That's to say, we need an argument that these moral attributes, like frequency and the rest, are inaccessible.